Hello, class. Today we are going to get to our third grand challenge explaining why environmental problems are so pervasive in society today. We started by talking about how we become distanced from our impact on the environment and how it's so hard for us to even see or know what our everyday actions are doing and the impact that those have on the environment. And then next we talked about exponential growth and looked at both exponential growth of the human population, but also of our consumption and how the growth in those areas are greatly increasing the amount of damage we're causing to the environment. And for this third grand challenge, we're going to look at specifically economic incentives that are embedded into the system today that encourage us to exploit the environment and degrade the environment. So these are incentives that are built into the way that the global economy works and that are very difficult to overcome without significant intentionality and that result directly in environmental degradation from that. So this is the last of our three grand challenges. And we will start off with a discussion of open access resources or common pool resources. Those two terms are interchangeable. You may hear me use them interchangeably, but open access resources and common pool resources are the same thing. And these are resources that are freely available to use in which beneficiaries cannot be excluded from doing them. So there are two fundamental aspects about these. These are resources, natural resources, resources that are available to use. The two fundamental characteristics are one, the difficulty of exclusion. In other words, it is difficult, if not impossible, to exclude users from taking advantage of that resource. So for example, think about fish in the ocean. It is essentially impossible to prevent people from buying a fishing boat, going out and fishing in the ocean. Now, there are various forms of regulation that can help control that, but that is an access that is freely available there for anyone to take advantage of. It is difficult to exclude people. Second, subtractability, meaning the more that people use the resource, the more that resource is either degraded in quantity or quality. So either, such as with fish, the more users there are catching fish, the fewer fish there are. So we have subtracted from the overall resource that is available for others. So not only is it possible to exclude people, but the more people take advantage of it, the more that resource declines. So the greater decline we see, the less of that resource is available for the future. Or it could be the more that is degraded in quality. Think of water pollution in a water system. So anyone who owns land adjacent to a river could build a factory and put a factory on that river and pollute into that river. That pollution degrades the quality of that river and of that watershed for everyone who uses that. So it has subtracted from the quality of that for everybody, including the landowner who is polluting it, suffers degraded quality from that. But you can't exclude people from doing that because if they own land that adjacent to it, then they can't be excluded. So these are open access or common pool resources. Some common examples of these, we've already mentioned several of these. Fisheries. Fisheries are a great example of a common pool resource or an open access resource. You can't exclude people from using it. The more people overuse it, the more it's degraded and subtracted from. Unregulated forests. Now, regulated forests are different because they're managed, but unregulated forests, think of the Amazon basin, large forest covering an enormous space of land that is not regulated at all. It's not managed. The countries adjacent to it do very little to protect it from illegal logging. So it is an open access resource. Anyone can go in and cut timber to sell for profit or to create more farmland, etc. Aquifers, large expanse of water underground. Anyone can tap into that and pull all the water they want from it. Waterways, water pollution, the atmosphere, think of the skies are an open access resource. Any company can dump their pollution into the sky and everybody suffers from air pollution or from carbon emissions, but there's no way to effectively prevent people from dumping their pollution into this resource, this open access resource that's freely available. Or internet traffic, for example. There's no way to prevent people from using the internet or from downloading or streaming as much as they want. And yet the more people that use it, the slower the internet becomes. So it's degraded in quality for those who are trying to use that as well. So these are open access resources, freely available for anyone to use. The more people who use them, the worse the more the resource is degraded, less available it is for the future. So this concept, which we frequently refer to as the tragedy of the commons, relates to the use of open access resources. And the idea comes originally from Garrett Hardin, who wrote an essay in 1968 in Science magazine. Garrett Hardin is a bit of a nasty guy. He was kind of a white supremacist. He had some really terrible ideas, but he also had a really important contribution to our understanding. That's really perhaps one of the most foundational things for understanding human interactions with the environment is this idea of tragedy of the commons. So bad people can still come up with good ideas. But essentially what the tragedy of the commons says is that rational people acting in their own self-interest will inevitably degrade an open access resource. Now I'm going to show a little bit video here in a moment to help explain this, but that's essentially the concept that when you have an open access resource that's freely available, and which the more people use it, the more it degrades, that inevitably people are going to abuse that resource. Now there are exceptions to that, which we'll talk about later on. But this is a super important concept, fundamental concept, really, to understanding human interactions with the environment, because it helps explain why we see the challenges we see in the world today, why those things exist, why climate change is such a difficult problem to solve, or why ocean plastics are so fundamentally complex to figure out how to address this. The tragedy of the commons explains why this is the case. It's because it's in our own self-interest to ignore the problem, to continue to contribute to the problem, even if we're harming ourselves in the process. Okay, let's look at this short video, and I think I've got to switch my screen share here. Let me switch over to, there we go.
This is a model called the tragedy of the commons, which should be called the problem with open access since it has little to do with the commons, and tragedy is kind of dramatic. Let's say there's some land with grass on it that people use as pasture for their animals. Nobody owns it, and anyone can come and graze their livestock here. We're assuming that people don't communicate or work together, so we would call this an open access field. Let's assume the number of animals this field can feed is based on the quantity and quality of the grass, which is based on the health of the soil, and it can only hold this many animals. This is the carrying capacity. If animals are added beyond this, the grass can't regrow fast enough to support them all. Also, the grass protects the soil from erosion. If too many animals are around, the field may decline in productivity, lowering the carrying capacity. The animals will be less healthy and provide lesser quality products, lowering the profit each animal provides. So it's in this group's best interest to keep the number of animals on the field at or below the carrying capacity. But every herdsman that puts an animal on the field will get the direct benefit that that animal provides for them, but they would only share a portion of the cost of the degraded field. If the field were at carrying capacity and a herdsman decides to add an extra animal, the added animal takes some of the food that would have gone to the others. This reduces their value. The owner of that additional animal comes out ahead because even though all his animals are a little bit less healthy, he has more of them. But each herdsman acts under these incentives and will keep adding animals to their herd or let their animals graze longer, so long as it's profitable to themselves. But really, they're all losing out, kind of like the prisoner's dilemma. Contrast this to a situation where only one person owns it. If they add an extra animal, they're only hurting themselves, so they don't do it. Since new people can't be excluded from the field, there's almost no point in boycotting the use because someone else could just come in. None of the herdsmen own the field, and they can see that the field may not be around forever. They see no point in conservation and just try to use it before someone else does. Okay, so we can go on to apply this model to unregulated open access fisheries, open access forests, and unregulated college dorm sink. But the problem with applying this model to the real world is that we have to assume, among other things, that people don't communicate or work together, which isn't true. With a field like this, people will generally get together and make plans about its use. They may act as a single unit or just partition it into sections, and they'll regulate the number of people that can use it. And if people are working together and communicating, then it's not really open access. It's not like every management situation is open access until somebody does something about it. So you don't tend to see the open access problem because people don't work together. You tend to see it in situations where people can't work together. Sometimes people are forced into a situation where they're not allowed to work together. Check out this video. Also, the large larger the management area is, the more difficult communication and influencing each other becomes. For example, the global management of greenhouse gas emissions tends to take on some open access properties. Basically, this model is a way of communicating that when people can't work together on a resource, you call it open access, and it's bad. Which is why the model should have been called the problem with open access.
Okay, back. So I like that video. It helps explain, I think, tragedy of the commons or problem of open access fairly well in a way that's understandable. This is the original scenario that Garrett Hardin set out, was this common field and overgrazing and the consequences that come from that. But let's give you a chance to reflect on this. And I want you to write down what are some examples that you can think of. So thinking of this kind of an open access challenge, maybe it's ones we already talked about or some other ones, but pause the video, write down some examples you can think of. So there's a number of different examples that you could come up with. Some examples from historical examples, the beaver pelts. I think we already talked about this in an earlier lecture, but we almost trapped beavers to extinction in the 17th, 18th century in North America because of this problem of open access, the tragedy of the commons, where there's nothing preventing, there was no way to exclude more fur traders from going in there and trapping beavers. And there's plenty of financial incentive for them to do so. And nevertheless, the more fur traders went in there, the more the resource, beaver pelts, was subtracted from. There were fewer of them available. So you can see how that leads toward a degradation of the resource itself. The global, the atmosphere in terms of the ability to put pollution into the atmosphere is a classic tragedy of the commons example. There's nothing preventing people from dumping pollution into the atmosphere, and yet doing so degrades the quality of our climate system and our atmosphere for everybody. Or whaling, we almost hunted whales to extinction again a couple hundred years ago for use of their resource of blubber and meat products from whale oil. But because of overuse, because of we couldn't prevent people, and so we almost hunted them to extinction. Classic tragedy of the commons examples. So, question for you: what can be done? Okay, here's a scenario I want you to think about. Imagine a factory like this that is polluting a river system. So let's pretend that this factory is polluting this river system. That pollution in the river system is causing negative consequences for everybody who lives nearby, people who use the water for irrigation or for drinking water. It makes the town downstream ugly and smelly. So there's a lot of negative consequences of this. What can be done to help resolve this tragedy of the commons problem? We talked about this. You can't exclude, if the company owns this land, you can't exclude or prevent them from building a factory on that land. And yet doing so degrades the quality of the water for all of the users. So what are some ideas about what can be done to help resolve this? Pause the video and write down some thoughts. So we're going to get to the answers to that in a little bit, and you'll see some ideas related to how we can resolve that. But I wanted to get you thinking about that first. So solutions to tragedy of the commons. First of all, it's worth noting open access problems can't be solved by individuals. They are inherently bigger than individuals. We're not talking about a decision that's within the scope of one person to be able to make. We're talking about things that are freely, because open access means they're freely available. Remember, that's in the definition of what is an open access problem, that it's freely available. You can't exclude people from accessing it. So because you can't exclude people, one individual alone can't act to resolve that open access problem. In other words, open access problems or tragedy of the commons examples can only be solved by government or community involvement. Individuals alone can't do this. So Garrett Hardin, what he wrote down as his solution was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. It sounds kind of heavy, but the idea being that the community mutually agrees to limit themselves in a certain capacity. So you certainly do see this played out in a number of different ways, but it requires coercion. In other words, it requires enforcement of certain limitations to using that resource, and the people, the users, have to agree to that limitation. So whether that is enforced through governance or whether that is enforced through community agreement, the idea being that the only way to come about to do that is to agree on that sense. So there's three sort of categories of solutions, and we'll look at each of these three in turn and in some detail. First being privatization. So one solution to an open access problem could be to privatize that solution, to make it private. It works because for one, it's no longer open access. If you're privatizing something, you are restricting access. You're removing access so you can exclude people. So it's no longer an open access problem. And then there becomes a financial incentive for the owner or the user of that resource to steward it well. So it's in the economic best interest of that owner to practice wise stewardship of that resource, because if they degrade that resource, they're only hurting themselves. Like you saw in the video, if one farmer owned the land, then he wouldn't abuse it by putting too many cattle or sheep onto the land, because it would only hurt himself to do so. So he has no interest in doing that. So privatization can work for that particular scenario. There are, however, some challenges related to privatization as a solution to open access problems. First of all, private owners sometimes still opt for short-term benefits. Maybe someone is really old and they're like, well, shoot, this forest isn't going to mean anything to me once I'm dead, so I might as well clear cut it and do away with it so I can reap the benefits now. That's a choice that landowners can make and frequently do make related to that. Opting for short-term benefits, or perhaps the stockholders are looking for positive returns on their investment now. So we're not going to worry so much about cleaning up our act in terms of how we produce within our industry, because we want to focus on short-term profits, because that's what our shareholders are most interested in. So that sometimes happens. Mistakes happen. Sometimes landowners, even if it's something that's privately held, will still continue to make some mistakes in the way that that is managed, or equitability concerns with how to allocate resources. That's certainly a challenge, and we'll look at some examples of that as well. And really the biggest problem is that most significant common pool resources or open access resources simply can't be privatized. You can't privatize the oceans or the atmosphere or a river system. These simply are impossible to privatize. So privatization can work in some isolated instance, but there are a lot of concerns even when it can work. And in many places, it simply isn't possible to do that. So this is a fairly limited solution to open access problems, the solution of privatization. It really only works for certain types of situations and doesn't for many others. A much more common solution that we see is that of regulation. So regulation, the basic idea is that if the resource belongs to a community, maybe it's the global community and the resource is the atmosphere, maybe it's a community that a river flows through and the resource belongs to the community. Everyone in the community uses it and benefits from it. So if a resource belongs to the community, then the community regulates it in the form of government acting in the behalf of the community. This is something referred to as the public trust doctrine. In other words, the government is entrusted with the care of the commons. Commons belongs to the community. The society benefits from that resource. And so society is entrusting the governance of that resource to the government in order to manage that. Now, various people have different perspectives on whether the government's capable of effectively governing such resources. But those concerns aside, there are no institutions beyond the government that are effective at managing resources that are held in common with a community of any size and scope. Anything beyond a localized community, you need some sort of collective entity to govern that. And that's the role that government tends to play in our societies as we have developed them. So this is particularly useful when privatization is not desirable or not possible. So if you can't privatize a resource, as frequently is the case, then regulation is often a useful response to open access challenges. Now, regulation can look one of two different ways. It can forbid certain actions, such as preventing companies from dumping certain pollutants into a river, or requiring coal power plants to put scrubbers in their smokestacks to take out harmful pollutants that go into the atmosphere. So those are specific actions that are mandated. Or a government can create market mechanisms to discourage or to encourage certain actions. So maybe the government puts a price on carbon dioxide emissions, so that rather than forbidding power plants from emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, instead they put a tax on that and charge power plants for doing it. So that creates an economic incentive for those power plants to change without government mandated ways of doing that. So there are different ways that regulation can look like. So let's throw out this question for you. What common scenarios do we see regulation applied to? What are some common situations or scenarios or examples, ones, for example, that we've already talked about, that you think regulation could work on? So there's a lot of different ways that we see this played out, a lot of theories for how this could work, and a lot of examples as well. Think of the national parks. National parks are in many ways an open access resource, in the sense that any American can go to a national park and make use and enjoy that. And yet we rely upon the government to oversee those and to hold those in common, to protect those for others to be able to enjoy. Or think about emissions controls for vehicles. Many states, New York included, require you to get annual emissions inspections. This is in order to reduce the amount of air pollution. So the atmosphere being a commons, an open access resource. If we didn't have emissions control inspections for vehicles, then people could get away with dumping lots of pollutants into the atmosphere by not keeping their car in proper functioning working order. Instead, this is one regulatory mechanism that the state of New York, in this case, has put into play to help regulate abuse of a common pool resource. Some challenges, obviously, global scale common pool resources or open access resources are particularly difficult. It's not so easy to regulate something that is on a planetary scale, simply because there is no global government. And in the absence of a global government, if an issue is relevant to every country, if something's contained within the borders of one country, then sure, it can be fully regulated and regulated effectively. However, if something is cross-border, multinational issue, or a global issue particularly, that makes it much more difficult to address. Also, a lot of people don't like regulation, so that's always a barrier. The third open access solution is called community-based governance. Community-based governance, essentially what this is, so this works on social institutions, rules, and norms in order to govern a particular situation. Usually this is found mostly in traditional societies or small communities, where it's easy for people to communicate together and to work out solutions based in their own best interests. So you see this a lot in traditional societies on managing a water resource, for example, or managing a grazing resource. Go back to Garrett Hardin's original example of a commons. This is a more traditional society, medieval England, for example, where you have a resource that's held in common, whether it's the village well, whether it's the village commons, and those are frequently managed on the community-based level by mutual understanding and agreements between the users of that resource. So it relies on these social rules and norms. These are the things you do and don't do related to using the well in our village or using the commons. Free riders must be kept very small. Free riders being those who take advantage of the system. There are always those who can take advantage of a system, putting that extra cow into the pasture land. And if too many people do that, then that very quickly overruns the management of that resource and it becomes a tragedy situation. So free riders have to be kept at very small, very few free riders. And trust and communication are critical for this. The only way that community-based governance works is if there's trust between the mutual users and communication between the mutual users of that resource. That's why this only works on smaller scale systems. You don't see this working on larger scale systems because you don't have the kind of trust and communication that are required to make it work. Now, in your reading, Ostrom listed out 8 principles for well-managed community-based commons. She was particularly interested in these kinds of examples, these community-based governance, because there are some great examples. Hardin completely overlooked this. He didn't list this at all as a solution to the commons. He only saw regulation or privatization in there. Ostrom put out that this has been done for centuries, or this kind of community-based governance of open access resources has worked very effectively for a long time. And she listed out 8 specific characteristics of that. Boundaries are clearly defined. The rules that they fit the local conditions, they make sense. Participants have a say. They're able to work together about what the rules should be. Control is local. Everything is fair. Basically, it should be fair. Everything should be fair, and significant trust and communication between the users of that resource, and then it effectively can work out. But again, community-based governance really only works on smaller scale kind of situations because you have to have that trust and that communication to be able to work. So for the most part, in terms of management of open access resources, regulation is our primary tool that we're left with. Privatization can work sometimes, but many things can't be privatized. Community-based governance can work sometimes, but only on smaller scales, or when there is open trust and communication, which frequently is not the case. So definitely some challenges that fit in there. Okay, a few challenges to open access management. First of all, the problem of inequality. We mentioned briefly, but let's say if you took that commons, that grazing commons, and subdivided it out in order to avoid a tragedy of the commons scenario where every farmer was able to graze their cattle and responsible for their section of land, that can work. It can work effectively. However, we saw, and this happened in the 17th, 18th, I forget, century, where in England, when they did this, they subdivided out, they called them enclosures. They created enclosures where each farmer, like you see in this picture, had a certain plot of land, and that was where they could graze their sheep. There's equity issues related to that. Who do you give a piece of land to, and who do you exclude? And how much land? Do you give everyone an equal amount? Or what about the family that has a larger size family? Or what about when the population grows? Then how do you take the land back in common and then redistribute again? That doesn't seem very fair either. There's lots of equity issues related to that. Or what we tend to see is that groups that don't have power tend to get excluded from these kinds of open access regimes. So for example, indigenous groups very frequently are on the outside and are not included in the process of managing common pool resources. And very frequently, indigenous groups are ones who have been taking advantage of those in a sustainable way. And yet, when you have companies that come in, like frequently we see in the Amazon, where you have oil companies will come in and drill for oil in land that has previously been managed effectively by indigenous people, and those people get pushed out of the land. And they lose access to the resource that they once had in order to give access to someone else that has become privatized and given to someone else. So there are frequently equity issues with open access management, especially when you're talking about privatization. Acknowledgement of the problem can be a significant challenge as well. So with open access issues, these are problems. Some of them are big problems, like the problem of climate change. And you have a lot of people, and particularly companies like Exxon, that have for many years downplayed or completely ignored the reality of the problem. So we know that now, thanks to leaked memos, that Exxon knew about the problem of climate change since the 1970s. In fact, wrote about and had their scientists looking at what, or since early 1980s. It's like, basically funding the kinds of climate denial communication that really convinced the public that this was not a settled science issue. And so you had a lot of challenges that arose from that, because many powerful companies are not acknowledging the problem, leading to many people not acknowledging the problem. And now all of a sudden, management, you haven't even gotten to the question, how do you manage an open access problem? Because there's a lot of people who are saying that it's not really actually a problem to begin with. So there's sometimes an economic incentive for obfuscating the problem or making it more difficult for people to know what to do about it. The scale of the problem, obviously the bigger the problem, like global commons issues, then the more difficult it is. The more actors that are involved, the more difficult it is to manage it. And that can create a lot of complexities to it, or the extent of the solution. How much pollution is okay? How much pollution in our atmosphere or pollution in our rivers is acceptable? That's a difficult question and relies upon a lot of science. And there's a bit of a relative aspect to that. How much pollution are we okay with in our river systems? What do we want to manage to? That can be really difficult and have significant implications for it. Or how much fish, how much degradation of fish species or loss of fish species is okay in the fish resource, in the fishery. What should we set fishing limits to? If we're going to set fishing limits as a regulatory mechanism to prevent tragedy of the commons related to overfishing, well, where should we set the limit? What's the sustainable point to set that at? And that's often a balance between income now versus long-term sustainability. Obviously, the higher the limit, the more fishers can benefit from that economically today. And yet, the more you're threatening the future long-term sustainability of that stock. And the lower the limit that you set, the safer it is from a long-term sustainability perspective, but the more constraints on the users of that resource. Okay, let's talk about global commons issues. And I want you to write down, what are some unique challenges to global commons? I feel like I worded that word strangely. Global commons, global open access resources, global commons, such as the atmosphere, such as the ocean with ocean plastics, such as international fisheries or multinational water basins. These are things that are global or multinational in scope. So what are some unique challenges that these present for how we manage them? Go ahead and pause and answer that. So for one, obviously they can't be privatized. That's certainly a big challenge. We don't know how to privatize global commons, global open access resources, because it can't be done. Community-based works better at a smaller scale, requires reciprocity, it requires trust and communication. And we do have mechanisms for nations to work together on things. That's in large part what the UN functions as the ability to convene people to discuss big global issues. So yeah, people can gather together under the auspices of the United Nations and talk about how do we address climate change. And that can be a way similar to community-based governance to begin to talk and agree together, but finding trust and effective communication between 195 nations with very different ideologies is much more difficult than finding trust between a few hundred villagers who share a well, for example. And global commons are difficult to regulate. Sure, individual nations can regulate CO2 emissions or can regulate how waste is disposed of, but what if other countries don't regulate that? Then that becomes ineffective on a global scale, maybe effective on a regional scale, but not effective for addressing the global issues that are at stake. And perhaps some sort of hybrid approach where individual countries implement regulation, but work on the global scene in order to convince other countries to implement those regulations as well. And we do have examples of those that have worked effectively. Some unique challenges. The global commons scaling up to 8 million people obviously is difficult. The cultural diversity in the mix, and think of how do you have a conversation about energy use between the United States and France and Russia and the Gambia and Pakistan, and all come out agreeing on the same conclusions. That's very difficult because there are very different realities, cultural realities, economic realities in these countries. And so that can be quite the challenge. Interconnection with other common pool resources, because all of these things play in together. So deforestation in the Amazon has significant impacts on global climate change and on the climates and the weather even of places on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So these impacts tie in together in significant ways. The interconnections are much more complicated than they used to be. As we've talked about before, we've become pretty distant from our environmental problems. We don't necessarily see the impact that we have on them. So yes, maybe we can acknowledge that there is a global problem of overfishing, but what do we do about that? Because how does my choice to buy fish at the supermarket near my home relate to this problem? It's not immediately obvious to me whether it contributes to it, and if so, how much. Accelerating rates of change, which we see regularly with particularly issues like climate change or biodiversity loss, where it seems like, it seems like it is, where these kinds of challenges are not just progressing incrementally, but are accelerating in terms of how bad they are for society. Requirements of unanimous agreement. For example, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which the Paris Agreement comes out of, requires unanimous agreement of all 196 signatories in order to implement anything under the Paris Agreement. So you have to have unanimity among all these different countries. So all those cultural diversity really plays into that here. When you have to have everyone agree, it's difficult. Human mobility complicates things as well, because we're all moving around the globe in big ways, and we only have one world, we only have one planet. So we better get this right the first time, and yet the difficulties are quite significant. Okay, here's another one I want you to think about. Let's think about ocean plastics. Most ocean plastics come from land-based sources: littering, urban runoff, improper waste disposal, illegal dumping, industrial activities that of course find their way into river systems and eventually into the ocean. There are other sources of ocean plastics. Fishing nets, discarded fishing nets is a big one. And microplastics is big too, from tire abrasion and from washing synthetic clothing. Very small bits of plastics that get washed out in many different ways and end up in the oceans as well. So a lot of different places that it comes from. Asia is the biggest source of ocean plastic, but that's not necessarily just because of plastic used there, but Asia is also, particularly places like China, are big producers of goods that get shipped around the world. So the demand in other places drives the pollution that comes from there. So with that in mind, what suggestions do you have for addressing ocean plastic in the ocean? Ocean plastic in the ocean, how's that for a phrase? Just think about this from a global commons perspective, an open access resource. What's an idea that might help address this on the global scale? I'm not talking about, I don't want to see answers about, I cannot litter anymore. Like, no, I'm looking not for individual responses here. I'm looking for societal responses, global responses. What are things that can be done on a large scale, on a global scale, to help address this? Okay, go ahead and pause it and address that question. It's a complicated question. It usually relates to things like international dialogue and international agreements, working together to find diplomatic solutions to that. Often it requires providing financial resources, particularly for developing countries. I think the Philippines particularly is a big source of plastics that go into the ocean. Well, Philippines is not a wealthy country. So if it's of high importance to reduce ocean plastics, and Philippines is a big contributor of that, then maybe some of the wealthier countries in the world need to make contributions to help financially incentivize that. That could be something that can be done. Or investing in large scale in technologies to help clean up ocean plastics would be important. Or maybe something needs to be done about fishing and the way we're fishing. Why is it that so many fishing nets contribute to ocean plastics? Is it necessary for fishing nets to be plastic? What about bioplastics in fishing nets? Is that an option? If so, how can we go about getting the international fishing industry to make this change? Maybe it has something to do with multilateral negotiations. Maybe some of the big players, the US, China, Japan, Norway, can gather together and make an agreement together. So if you get the biggest players in the room to all agree on making a change, then that makes a big difference as well. So usually addressing these global commons issues requires a lot of diplomacy, a lot of international negotiations and working together to make agreements. Often those agreements require trust. Goes back to the community-based governance. There's a lot in common between the global commons issues and community-based governance, only it's infinitely more complicated because you have so much diversity, so much differing opinions, so many more actors involved, but that need to find solutions through communication and through trust is the only way forward for some of that. We do have some examples of success stories. One success story I'm going to share, and then one that is still in process that hasn't particularly been successful, but is helping. So first of all, we discovered in the 1970s, and then particularly going into the mid 1980s, that certain chemicals were disrupting the ozone layer in the stratosphere. So the ozone layer in the stratosphere, the role of that was to block ultraviolet radiation from entering the Earth's atmosphere. Without that ozone layer, we would get sunburned very quickly. So we found that certain chemicals, particularly chlorofluorocarbons, which were used in refrigerants and aerosol cans, used to be, would break down ozone in the stratosphere. And particularly, they were collecting around Antarctica and caused this big ozone hole. Basically, a place where the layer of ozone in the atmosphere above Antarctica was very thin. We discovered this, and this is highly problematic because the ozone layer in the stratosphere is critical for us to be able to be outside and not get sunburned. There would be significant consequences for humanity if we didn't have an ozone layer in the stratosphere. So the world came together in 1987 in Montreal and signed what's called the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol phases out ozone depleting substances, particularly chlorofluorocarbons, over a period of time. So this is a multilateral environmental agreement, and it addresses ozone depleting substances. It's actually the only UN treaty ratified by all 198 UN member states, the only one. But it phases out ozone depleting substances over a period of time. It uses this phrase, equal but differentiated responsibilities. In other words, it acknowledges that some countries are the bigger perpetrators and have easier capacity to switch away from ODSs, ozone depleting substances. Other countries, it's more difficult. And so they put a different timetable for those countries. So the agreement was wealthier countries would have a faster timetable, poorer countries would have a longer timetable, and would have something called a multilateral fund that the wealthy countries would pay into that would help poorer countries make that transition. So there was financial resources to help those poorer countries make the transition away from that. Some strengths of the protocol, industry supported the transition. One of the keys to the success of the Montreal Protocol was that the chemical industry supported this, in large part because they had alternatives available. There were options for accomplishing the needs that chlorofluorocarbons had, but that weren't ozone depleting substances. And so we transitioned away from that. Alternatives were available. It also wasn't politicized yet in the way that global warming has become politicized today. The ozone hole was not politicized in that way. Fortunately, we recognized the problem and responded before it could get politicized. If only we had done that on global warming too. And as you can see, it was extremely successful. That over time, this is over a period from 1989 to 2014, we are almost down to almost zero ozone depleting substances in the world. And thus it was seen as a great success story. So there is an option of success for dealing with global commons issues. And that's what it looks like. This is a model for what it can look like. It requires agreement from every country, essentially, particularly from the major users and the major perpetrators. And you need to have a lot of flexibility built into that. It's important to get support from outside of the government as well. Those are some of the keys. The other one I want to highlight, Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement, per se, has not yet been particularly, it certainly hasn't been successful, but it has been effective, I think, at slowing carbon emissions and creating a mechanism that the world can come together to respond to to climate change particularly. So some basics about the Paris Agreement, and I think we'll revisit this later too. Paris Agreement signed in 2015 it was signed by all UN member nations. there are 4 countries that haven't ratified it yet. Everyone's signed it. I think it's like Iraq and South Sudan and Yemen and someone else, Eritrea maybe, maybe not Iraq, Iran, one of those 2 haven't ratified it. Paris Agreement sets a temperature target of, we want to limit global warming to not more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages, and ideally aim for a 1.5 degree target. Now we've already gotten to 1.1, so we are well on our way to blowing through our targets. Thus why many people criticize the Paris Agreement as being ineffective. Nevertheless, it has created a framework that the world has agreed upon, that essentially almost every nation has agreed upon, and certainly every, not important, but every significant contributor of CO2 emissions has agreed to this. Universal participation, like I said, every country signed it, all but 4 have ratified, and all of the major emitters have ratified. Also includes this common but differentiated responsibilities, this idea that some countries are more responsible than others and need to make a better effort. But the cornerstone of the Paris Agreement are these things called nationally determined contributions. What NDCs are, each country that is party to the Paris Agreement brings their nationally determined contribution to the table and says, this is how much we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by this certain date. So this is our voluntary commitment of what we're going to commit to doing. So the only accountability mechanism is that peer pressure to stick to your commitments. There's no enforcement mechanism. There's no legal requirements. There's only the voluntary contributions that each country says, this is what we're going to work toward and work toward achieving. Also, every 5 years, each country is required to revisit their commitment and encouraged to increase the ambition of their commitment. The idea being the first commitments that were brought in Paris were not going to be effective at limiting global warming to 2 degrees. I think it's something like 3.4 degrees that it would have limited them to. So the idea being every 5 years, let's bring back new, more ambitious commitments. So right now we're on track for about a 2.7 degree target. Still too much. But the idea being that if we regularly revisit this and get more ambitious targets, then eventually that will help increase. So this has been a helpful framework for helping countries come together to be able to address this in a productive manner, and one where every country has a role and can participate in. Also includes, like with the Montreal Protocol, some financing mechanism for less developed countries, particularly around adaptation, adapting to climate changes, and loss and damage. Well, that's not funded yet and controversial. And I'm going to skip over that because it takes some explanation, and I think we're going a little bit long here already. But Paris Agreement, good framework for something that could help address global commons challenge. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. Last concept I want to talk about is another. So most of this lecture has been about tragedy of the commons and open access resources. This is the other economic incentive for exploitation, and this relates to a concept called economic externalities. So externalities are a cost or benefit received by a third party who has no control over the factors that created that cost or benefit. So in other words, this is a cost that is imposed upon a third party that had no say in whether they incurred that cost or not. These are known as a market failure because the market is not taking into account the full cost of a certain activity. Here are some examples. Cancer clusters near toxic waste dumps. So toxic waste dumps, the companies that dispose of toxic waste are not paying the costs of the people who get cancer because they live near the place where those are disposed of. So we see this all the time where toxic waste dump sites, people who live near them get cancer at rates that far exceed the average. The costs that those people pay in terms of shortened lifespans, in terms of medical costs, those are not priced into whatever widget toxic waste company was selling. That's not priced into that. So that's an external cost. Air pollution from vehicle traffic. Air pollution undoubtedly has significant economic consequences for our country in terms of asthma rates, in terms of cardiovascular problems, in terms of pollution. There's a lot of problems and a lot of economic costs that come from air pollution, but those are not accounted for in the things causing the pollution. Secondhand smoking, for example. If a child grows up in a home where someone smokes, that child has no say over whether they smoke or not, and yet they are going to suffer the consequences of that in their own lungs. Lead pollution from corroded water pipes, climate change impacts. There are some positive examples. There's a lot more negative than positive examples. But let's say if you own an orchard, your neighbor owns an apiary, then you're going to benefit from that apiary through pollination. So there's some positive examples. Okay, last two questions here. Economic externalities. So answer me this, and I think it's already even gone up from 350. I had that on there from a little bit ago. Who knows what this is going to look like when you're watching this in the fall. But question 6, what costs are included in the $3.50 per gallon cost of gas? Okay, hopefully you thought of things like these. So the cost of extracting that petroleum from the ground or from the ocean is included in there. Refining costs, that petroleum has to be refined so that it can be used. That's included. And they're the corporate costs for the company, for Exxon, to run their headquarters and to heat their building and to employ all of their employees. And the cost of transporting that, whether it's through a pipeline or through a truck to get to the gas station. And then finally, the cost of running the gas station and the convenience store. The $3.50 per gallon of gas that you pay at the pump includes all of those costs. So all of those costs are included in that price. Next question, what costs are not included? What are the external costs? So there's plenty of these as well. Oil spills. When there's a massive oil spill, often the companies get away. They're not held accountable. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. And even when they are, they're rarely held accountable for the full costs of cleaning up that disaster. Or the costs related to pollution, like we talked about before, air pollution. When you burn a gallon of gas, that's creating air pollution. When a billion people with a billion cars burn gas, that's creating a lot of air pollution. And that air pollution has economic consequences for society, and those consequences, those costs are not included in the gallon of gas. Or climate change impacts. The burning gasoline is a big contributor towards climate change. That has significant impacts, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks here, significant costs associated with that on society, and unfortunately, most frequently on impoverished people tend to be on the front lines of those impacts. Those costs are not included. So there are a lot of costs that are included, and there's a whole lot that aren't included. And those are externalities. It's called a market failure. The market is not accounting for those costs. And so there's no incentive. There's no incentive for ExxonMobil to reduce their carbon emissions because they're getting away with it because the costs aren't included in there. Okay, here's another short video that, I'm just going to skip this video. You can look this up. It's just a 1.5 minute video that another phrase that we sometimes use relates to the social cost of carbon. In other words, the cost to society, the external costs, the costs that are not incorporated in the activity itself. So it's another helpful way to think about it. All right, solutions to externalities. There's a couple of different ways that we can deal with externalities. Really, we have two solutions available. We can regulate it. So force companies to stop imposing third-party costs by cleaning up their production, cleaning up the problem that's there. If the problem is that they're dumping pollution into a river system, they can be forced by the government to stop doing that. They can be forced to implement technologies that prevent that. Make sure that the social costs, the externalities, are absorbed by the companies, that they need to deal with that, hey, it's unacceptable for you to be putting these costs on society, so you need to clean up your act so that these costs are not included there. There's guaranteed environmental benefits there, but often these are economically inefficient because forcing companies to eliminate pollution, and sometimes, very frequently, regulations force very specific types of technologies to do so. And that's not always the most economically efficient way of doing it. It can be very effective for addressing the environmental problems, but not always the most efficient way to do it. But regulation tends to be the way that we usually work on this. Tends to be the government's go-to method for dealing with externalities. The other one is a price fix. So if we don't want to force companies to implement certain technologies or to clean up their production, many times a simpler way is to simply charge polluters for their pollution. So pricing pollution. This is actually a fairly economically elegant way of doing that, because what you're doing is you're taking that external cost that's not included in the cost of the product, and you're forcing it to be included by putting a price on it. So if you're pricing pollution, that's making the product more expensive. But in the process of making it more expensive, it's actually paying its true cost to society, because that cost that's paid for it can be used to help offset the problem over here. So the social costs, the externalities, are accounted for through this external pricing mechanism. That one has uncertain environmental benefits, but it's much more economically efficient. And if priced correctly, can have really positive results. We're going to dig more into some price fix solutions later on in the semester, but make sure that you understand not only how externalities work and examples of externalities, but the two broad solutions to these here, that you can either regulate them or you can put a price fix on it in order to incorporate that cost back into the cost of the product. If you're not understanding economic externalities, make sure that you do understand these, because this is an important concept. Okay, last thing to say, you do have a piece of homework, so make sure that you do that. Look in the course online to find the details for that. Okay, I think that's it for today. Thank you.